Welcome to IG's investment channel. Canadian venture exchange listed Royal Helium is searching out a London listing. It's focused in on the exploration and development of primary helium in southern Saskatchewan, Canada, and is currently one of the largest helium leaseholders in the country. But what sort of investment does it project for us here on this side of the Atlantic? Well, joining us now is Andrew Davidson. He's the Chief Executive and President of the company. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be able to catch up with you. Look, you're in London to talk to various people ahead of what you hope will be a listing in London. I want to get onto that in just a minute, but I want to start at the very bottom and ask you why helium? What is helium to us and sort of investment opportunities?
Well, to you folks in the UK, it's the same as it is to most people around the world. It's a misunderstood and overlooked inert gas used extensively in multiple industries. So it tends to get lumped into the energy bucket, which is a bit of a misnomer because there's no energy component to it whatsoever. What it is used for is as a superconductor and industrial coolant, principally. And historically speaking, it's a healthcare gas, with the majority of global supply fueling MRI machines around the world. But interestingly, over the past number of years, there's been a growing demand in these more high-tech industries, such as the manufacturing of semiconductors and microchips, et cetera, and in rocketry, where it's used as the purge gas in the fuel system. And so it's these new demand sources, coupled with a major supply shortfall, that have really made it an interesting place to be.
Let me ask you a question about green helium, because that's on one of the front pages of your website. You're talking about green helium. What is green helium?
Important to note that there's no real color gradient for helium. Helium produced in Saskatchewan is valued the same as helium produced anywhere. The difference being that we produce gas in Saskatchewan as a byproduct of nitrogen, as opposed to a byproduct of natural gas. And that's a very important difference for a couple of reasons. One, it's a cleaner source. We're not generating any significant emissions in producing our gas. And there is no greenhouse gas effect to nitrogen. It's simply vented to the atmosphere. So on an operating cost basis, it's also much, much cheaper. But in Saskatchewan, being virtually the only place in the world that produces helium without methane, makes it some 90 to 99% more carbon efficient than production anywhere else in the world.
And about this demand-supply issue at the moment, what are you selling into? What's the market like?
Well, critically undersupplied is what the market is like. Helium production has been dominated historically by three jurisdictions: the US, Qatar, and Russia. And there was a structural supply gap before the Russian actions in the Ukraine, but since then it's become critical to the point where end users of helium gas are now coming up and talking to producers such as ourselves with a view to securing long-term supply. And it's something that's never been seen before in this space. And clearly, when you're in a structural supply gap with no mitigation on the horizon, we've seen prices spike dramatically over the last 6 months.
And who sets those prices?
Well, they're negotiated between producer and buyer in every case. There's no spot market for helium. So in order to determine how the market is really moving, it's a function of talking with multiple purchasers at any one time to get a feel for how the market is moving.
Okay, so your helium could in theory go anywhere, but in fact you concentrate on the space market, I believe. Is that right?
We do, yes. Our first offtake is with a company in the space exploration business.
Does that happen to be because you're in Saskatchewan? It just happens to be a local offtake agreement?
No, really, it's a function of not being able to access reliable supply and being shorted on their allocations from their other partners, we believe. Helium is not a replaceable product in any one of its uses, and that includes the space launch industry. So if there is a shortage, they simply don't get to launch. And so a lot of these groups have been moving, as I mentioned, from buying from industrial gas companies alone to buying from industrial gas companies and producers, with a view to almost owning molecules as they come out of the ground.
Yeah, and presumably it's not reusable. I guess once you've used it, it's gone, it's
That's
finished,
correct.
and it's out of the window. Let me pick up on that point about Ukraine and what's happening at the moment with this conflict in Ukraine, for want of a better word. What is that doing to the market? I mean, you were talking about prices spiking. What was Ukraine or Russia responsible for in terms of market share and
Yeah, it was somewhere below a third of market share. Again, they are one of the big three producing regions. So the world is having to find alternative sources for it. And helium's not like other elements where you can find it in multiple jurisdictions around the world. There are very specific places you have to go. because helium is only created from the natural decay of uranium and thorium. You need to find a location with high levels of uranium concentration, which makes Saskatchewan a logical choice, as we have the highest uranium concentrations in the world. So it's not as if you could simply say, okay, there's no more production from Russia, we're going to move over to California and produce there. You could try, but you're not going to find any helium there. So the limited supply jurisdiction-wise makes us a logical choice.
Yeah, and competitors? Are there many in the market? I mean,
It's growing. It's growing as the world's become more and more aware of this, the urgency of the supply deficit. There has been more exploration companies come into market, but in terms of companies that are growing from exploration and turning into a production company in the near term, there aren't that many.
So you're up and running. Is there a low bar to entry for new, if they see a gap in the market? I mean, as prices rise, quite often you see companies come into a market. Is it a high or low bar for entry?
Well, it's a low bar to acquire rights to explore for helium, but when it comes time to actually putting a drill in the ground and then building a production facility to process that gas, it's a commitment. And helium is not as simple to capture as standard oil and gas. Helium is so mobile as an element. If there's any crack in the cap rock system at geological depth, the helium will simply escape. So you really have to find a perfect storm of ground where the uranium concentrations are high and the structural capping mechanisms are fully intact. So it's hard to find. It's hard to explore for. It's hard to find an economic quantity, and then costly, at least initially, to buy the processing equipment required.
Does it rely on hydrocarbons to go through the process? I mean, I'm thinking about some of the metals. When you're producing some of these metals, they're very high oil usage or some other form. Do you have any other raw material costs that go into producing helium?
Not significantly, no, because the formations we drill into are relatively deep in sort of the 25 to 2,800 meter depth. So there's a lot of pressure down there. So the gas moves up on its own. And because we don't have any significant hydrocarbons, we certainly don't rely on that. Other parts of the world do. I mean, as I mentioned, everywhere else in the world, it's a natural gas byproduct. In Saskatchewan, it's the primary target, and that's why it's referred to as primary helium. We are drilling specifically for helium.
And what's your life of mine or whatever like, and what are you offering to investors? I want to go into the IPO in just a minute, but as you come over here to look for a new market to list, what are you saying to potential investors about the mine?
Well, we know...
Is it called a mine?
Well, they're wells. It's drilled very similar to what's drilled exactly the same as oil and gas.
Right.
We use their rigs, but
the
wells have a tendency to last for about 10 years. In Saskatchewan, in Alberta, where we also have a project, it's marginally less than that. So they're long life wells with a very stable production timeline, I should say. The decline curve is very shallow. So the wells are very economic and they pay back very, very quickly. In our case, less than 6 months to recover your drilling capital. And because we have 1 million acres of exploration ground, we have a very extensive runway to continue to add production into facilities that we construct to process gas.
So you're over here in London,
Yes.
Aiming to IPO on the London AIM market,
Yes.
Mid-November, I believe. Is that
That's
right?
correct. Yes.
How's the journey been so far? It's not a particularly good time to list, it has to be said. But if you've got a product where you're talking about the dynamics very heavily in your favor, I guess this could well stand out.
Well, we have a few things helping us. Obviously, the markets are not terrific right now. And when we started this process, we did not envision it looking like this. But we have a project that is going to be cash flowing within 6 months. So it's not an exploration company anymore. It's a development company, and that helps. So meeting with groups here, the most interesting thing to us is that everyone understands the helium market, at least somewhat. On the North American side, that's not the case. We spend most of our meetings educating people, but people here are knowledgeable as to what that market looks like, which gives us a great deal of comfort in that we don't have to spend time teaching. We can spend time talking about the economic opportunity that we provide. So we have the cash flow working in our favor, the development side working in our favor, and the fact that we produce a gas that's not at all greenhouse gas intensive. It's very much something that would be popular with the ESG crowd as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about London and how many shares are coming to the market. Have you got what are you hoping to sell in terms of percentage of your overall market cap, and what do you anticipate the market cap to be?
Yeah. So it's going to be roughly a third of the eventual market cap that comes out here.
Right.
Roughly. We're looking for a more diversified shareholder base. That's the principal reason for coming here. We have tapped most of the market in Canada. We've touched most of the major funds that would invest in something at this stage. And we're just looking for more eyeballs, frankly, and groups that really understand that the helium industry is not an energy story. It is an industrial. It is a high tech story. It is a healthcare story, because these are the industries that use it. It's not consumed in the energy cycle. And in Canada, because of the way our markets are, and because it's a resource country, we get lumped into the energy bucket straight away. Which is understandable and makes some sense. But as we move from exploration into development, it really needs to be tied in more with industrials and healthcare and high tech versus just energy.
And you hope to raise how much?
20 million Canadian dollars.
Right, okay. And what is that going to do, apart from bolster the balance sheet somewhat?
Yeah, it's going to help us develop a fair bit quicker. We're going to deploy
in
that.
Saskatchewan, or are you looking to acquire other wells?
In Saskatchewan. So we've got enough wells that we've drilled so far that just need to be turned on. And so it's going to help in terms of acquiring the facilities we need to process gas, as well as drilling additional targets. We have in our 12 to 18 month plan facilities such that we could process up to 30 million cubic feet of raw gas. Our initial facility is 15 of that 30. But that makes us a very relevant helium producer in a very short time period. And understanding that we've got contracts in place for 40% of that initial production, we'll have 100% of that sold by the time our first plant comes on. The cash flows look, frankly, remarkable.
Let me bring up a share price chart of the Venture Exchange listed stock, which is, and I was talking about the fact that the markets have emptied out recently. I was talking, interesting enough, to a small cap portfolio manager last week, and he was saying, looking at share prices like this, obviously you've got to dig down to find exactly what's going on, but exactly the dynamics you talk about. You look at some of these companies being sold off indiscriminately. What would you say about the share price at 25.25, which is where we are on Canadian dollars? What are you saying to investors about where you are and the opportunities that you see developing, bearing in mind your opportunity in terms of business?
Sure. I would say that the share price in no way matches the reality of the value of the company. When we compare ourselves to other helium companies out there, we're valued the same or less than most of them, which is odd considering that we're ahead of all of them in terms of development path. So I think to a great degree, we had a sell-off specifically in the last week or so, anticipating we would be raising money, which in fact we did last week on the Canadian markets. So you can see that baked in there. Unsure as to what's causing the sell-off. I mean, frankly, we've hit every milestone that we set.
Well, this is what the AIM investor was talking about, the fact that there's an opportunity here to pick up some absolute gems in the market. It'll be interesting to see how the IPO goes when it happens. What do you then, after from the IPO, obviously you've engaged hopefully with these other investors in a market that appreciates what it is you're trying to do. What are you then going to say about the next 12 months, and where do you hope to be? And let's assume that Ukraine and Russia come back online, which ultimately could see the price dip again.
Yes, it could. And the nice thing about our industry, it's a double-edged sword, I suppose. The fact that we're locking into sales agreements mean that we know the pricing that we're going to be selling into for the relative long term. So if Russia comes back online in 6 months, that's great. It means the war ended.
Of course, indeed,
But for us, it impacts what we sell our next round of contracts at, because we already have locked in pricing. So it has an impact for sure, but it's a longer term impact. So over the next 12 months, what are we going to do with the proceeds of the raise, and how are we going to accrete value for our new shareholders and our old ones? Simply by delivering on our exploration plans. I mean, becoming a producer of 30 million cubic feet of raw gas on a daily basis warrants a much more bullish valuation than we have. And when we look at how professionals value our company, or what they think we should be valued at, the pricing is, in the range of $1.50 to $1.85 per share versus the 25 cents that we see today.
Yeah. So just explain when you hope production to start, and how quickly you're going to ramp up to your full speed.
Well, we've started the construction process of our facility now. It will be done by March, and we'll be producing into our first contract in early April. So again, the cash flow really kicks in the first day of the second quarter of next year. So very, very soon.
So how much of that 20 million Canadian you're going to have eaten through by the time you get that first helium?
Well, very little, because the money we raise here is going to be deployed on drilling as opposed to building facilities. We have alternative credit facilities that we'll be using to construct our processor. So the money that we raise here is purely targeted towards increasing our production as opposed to initiating our production. I think that's a very important distinction, because the initiating production cost has been spent or will have been spent using alternative forms of financing. The money we raise here is specifically to take us from an early stage producer to a large scale producer.
Well, look, we wish you luck, and we're interested to see how the IPO goes. Please do come back, won't you, when you've got the production underway and we can see exactly how things are performing. But in the meantime, Andrew, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks indeed for joining us. It's Andrew Davidson. He's President and Chief Executive of Royal Helium. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGCom, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.